I welcome you at the second day of our seminar dedicated to the 80th anniversary of the tragedy in Babyn Yar. Our colloquium, Holocaust in Ukraine, Historiographic Trends, Commemoration, and Making Sense of the Crime. Before we start our sessions, a few announcements on corrections in the agenda that we've had to make. The third and the fourth session today will occur without a break between them. There is no break between the third and the fourth session, and the fourth session will be moderated by Yaroslav Hrycak, who's agreed to moderate. I would also like to point out that the format today is the speakers of each session have their remarks or their presentations, after which discussants express their reflections to those presentations. There's been a small change in the first session. We only have 3 speakers today. 3 speakers. Pavlo Hudish will not be able to join us today, unfortunately. And it is now my honor to give the floor to the moderator of this first session, Mr. Leonid Finberg. Thank you. Is the floor now mine? Yes. Director of the Center for the Study of the History and Culture of East European Jewry of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, Mr. Leonid Finberg. Yes, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of the participants of this conference, roundtable, colloquium, whatever we call it. But essentially, it's the same thing. It's academic presentations by people studying very serious topics, subjects. I would like, first of all, to welcome our guest, Kai Struve. Because there are not so many scholars of that level focusing on our problems, well familiar both with the Ukrainian language and the historiography of the subject. And I can say this because I think in the nearest time, within a month or so, maybe 6 weeks, we're publishing Kai Struve's monograph on the events in Ukraine. So again, I welcome everybody, and particularly our guest. Kai is with us now, yes? Professor Struve is with us? Yes, he's with us, he's listening in. Okay, thank you. Now, I understand that we're going to start with a presentation by Mr. Struve, or do we start with the presentations by our Ukrainian scholars? No, we start with the Ukrainian scholars, and then after which Dr. Struve will be able to present his remarks or recommendations or points. Okay, so the first on the agenda is Ms. Marta Havryshko, and she will now speak. The floor is yours. Right. Can you see my screen? Right. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to welcome the participants of our colloquium, as well as those from the broader public who are tuning in to discuss these very complicated pages of the history of the Holocaust in the Ukrainian lands. I would like to present today one of the aspects of this difficult story of human relations that has to do with the gray area. I would call it the gray zone, according to Primo Levi, the gray area of human sexuality in conditions of extremity in extremis in genocide. I'm talking about sexual barter in the Holocaust. This subject is very difficult. It's been taboo for a long time, Discussions around this topic were catalyzed recently. Some of you perhaps know the words Buried Words by Molly Applebaum, who survived the Holocaust and wrote her diaries in a bunker. In 2017, this was published with an introduction by Jan Grabowski. In this diary, she describes, together with her cousin Helen, how they hid how they were hidden, how they hid with a Polish family, a husband and wife. Later, she, through her efforts, this man, Victor, was given the title of the Righteous of Nations, Righteous Gentiles. In the interview that Molly gave to the Shaw Foundation, she never mentioned that she had sexual liaisons with Victor as a 13-year-old. Later, from her diary, the broader public found out that Victor essentially had sexual liaisons, not just with her, but also with Helena. This is a difficult story from several viewpoints. Firstly, there is the extreme disbalance of power between Victor, who was sheltering these two girls, and the actual girls. There's a huge disbalance of power between Victor and these girls, because the girls were, first of all, not of age, and secondly, they were completely dependent on Victor. However, in their later interviews, Molly said that she insists that Victor saved her and Helena, and she views what happened as entertainment. Zoe Waxman recently, in an article, pointed out this interpretation, stressed this interpretation, and stressed that we as scholars have to take into account the comments of the victim, of the woman herself, as she describes the situation. In the context of Ukrainian cases, we see how the topic of sexual bata is silenced and tabooed. How after the war, these women were stigmatized, which brought to the fact that women simply shut up and they wouldn't talk about how they survived the Holocaust. The topic of sexual bata was so taboo that there would be different versions of the same event. For instance, the case of the family of Wassermann, the two Wassermann daughters who were sheltered in a bunker in Ternopil for about 9 months with a Polish man named Krupa. There was a group of Jews. There were two families there. One of the survivors who sheltered with those girls mentioned that Krupa's cousin required more money for the shelter. However, they were out of money, so they were threatened. They threatened to give them up to the Germans. And she mentions that once Wassermann's cousin demanded that Genka come out to his house upstairs from the bunker and have a sexual encounter with him. She concludes this episode by saying that because Genka fainted, she was replaced by her older sister. There's a completely different version of this event described by Lola's cousin, Felicia. She doesn't mention the fact of the older sister volunteering. Essentially, she said that there was tension in the bunker. The women cried. The men were nervous, and they understood that this is this point where they are And she mentions that the father of the girls spoke to Krupa and very roughly told him that they would rather give themselves up to the German if he crosses this line, if he crosses this moral line, this moral and humane line. So Felicia actually doesn't mention the fact of this sexual volunteering, this sexual bata. Why does she keep this to herself? Why does she not mention it? Well, Wassermann's older daughter wasn't the only one who made this decision. The entire group made the decision. The entire group who was in the bunker. So essentially everyone, men and women of age, they carry their share of responsibility for what happened to Wasserman's daughter. So the girl agreed, she volunteered to be raped to save not only herself, but the entire group of people. As of today, there are discussions in historiography as to how we treat this gray zone, this gray area, this tabooed, stigmatized sexuality. How do we even talk about the fact that survival was not always surrounded by honorable acts? Those who suffered in the Holocaust and survived are not saints. They might have resorted to all kinds of means. From the point of view of present day social morality, they may seem controversial, particularly from the point of view today. Myrna Goldenberg, back in the 1990s, as early as in the 1990s, she talked about coerced sexual activity. She stressed the limited agency of the women. Elizabeth Heinemann came out with the term prostitution from hunger, essentially stressing that women used their body for basic needs. Christy Chadwick mentions sex for survival, again stressing the disbalance of power between the saviors, so to speak, and the victims, primarily the women. Barter Sex for Survival by Lynn Root. Katarzyna Persson, in describing sexual barter in the Warsaw Ghetto, talks about prostituted relations. Finally, Aina Haikova essentially solidified the term that we now use. It's sexual barter. As she understands not only sexual character, but also romantic relations that might not have included sexual links. She also stresses the queer relation of this nature of these events when people of the same sex might have been involved. In my presentation, I will use her terminology of sexual barter. This terminology allows us to talk about an economy of genocide, an economy of war, when women and young women, without having protection or material resources, without men or relations of any kind, they had extremely limited resources. Among these resources was the body. It was perhaps sometimes one of the most important ones. So in discussing sexual barter, we have to look at the agency of these women. Anna Haikova stresses that sexual barter includes primarily agency. It has to do with displacing the stress from a discourse of victimhood to a discourse of agency. So each case of this sexual barter has to be viewed in the context of this agency. We must look at this dynamics of power, at the conditions in which women and men found themselves when they had to barter their body to save themselves and their near and dear. Now, I will look at several specific cases to describe the function of the sexual barter. On this slide, you see a picture from a criminal case against Ivan Tchaikovsky. This was a policeman in the Kamieniec-Podilsky ghetto. And here's one of the women, Clara, who survived in the ghetto. She names names of several girls who told her personally that Tchaikovsky would not let them outside of the ghetto to barter with the local population so that they can buy food and survive. And she marks this as rape. However, how did the women themselves mark it? Genia Bromberg, 23-year-old, also says that one of the policemen tried to shelter her, and they encountered a different policeman, Kirilo Fedorov. Genia gave her the things that she had. uh, including a good shirt or blouse that she had. She said, however, Fedorov demanded sexual services, and Genya agreed. And this is when, during this investigation, that Genya stressed this disbalance of power. She says, she clearly marks it as coercion, sexual coercion, sexual violence. Obviously, this was done in order that the Soviet investigators include a charge of sexual violence against Kirill Fedorov. However, many women, in describing the fates of other women who resorted to sexual barter, stress the volunteer nature of this nature, that many women were clear about their difficult situation and understood the benefits they might obtain from a particular communication with men in power. And so Helena Klotzman, who was in Antonivka in Kyiv region, and she says there was a girl from Pyatigorsk. She herself resorted to this and she was allowed to leave the camp and she escaped. However, we see here the people's reaction, a separate, an outside person's response. So we understand that there were women who were vulnerable, but they disagreed, they rejected sexual contact with men. And so these stories essentially allow us, or these stories, let's say, they make possible some of the negative responses against the women who made the opposite decision. However, in each situation, we must look at the ability to say no, the extent to which the woman had the ability to reject this violent proposition. Because as Sonia says, she mentions the proposal being propositioned by a Pole to be involved with him sexually in exchange for shelter. She said she stresses her agency that she would have preferred to die. However, in this case, the Pole was unarmed, and behind him, her husband was behind her in the same shelter, who could have helped her. Additionally, the Pole was a friend of a friend, so she was hopeful that in case this situation becomes clear, so she basically she threatened him with exposure. Which stopped him. When we were looking at Koropets in Ternopil region, several eyewitnesses of the Holocaust, non-Jewish eyewitnesses, told us the story of Rivka, a young, beautiful woman who died right in front of this building that you see on the slide. She was killed by her lover, a German. This is according to the eyewitness stories, so we'll have to identify him according to other sources. But this is a story that we heard in recording interviews with different people. All of they stressed that Rivka agreed to the sexual contact with this German for the sake of her of saving her life and her parents' life, and she was left alone essentially until the moment that the German essentially decided to get rid of her and publicly executed her essentially in the public square. This was the center of the town. When we look at the case against Andrei Kovalyuk, a policeman in Brailev, we see numerous recollections of eyewitnesses, men and women of Jewish extraction, survivors in Brailev, and they all say that Kovalyuk sexually exploited young women in exchange for promises to save their lives. And many girls went along with it. A Jewish gynecologist who helped some of those young girls named dozens of women, young women, who were victims of this Andrei Kovalyuk. The second problem I would like to point out in this phenomenon of sexual barter in extreme times is consequences. Now, even when women agreed to sexual barter, this barter had very serious psychological and physical consequences for them. First of all, above all, this had to do with their self-appraisal, self-esteem, their perception of themselves, self-perception. Because in discussing the sexual mores of the time, we have to understand that it differs from the sexual mores of today. Jewish girls at the time were raised in concepts of purity and from height, righteousness. We know that older Jewish women who discuss sexuality during the war, they say that after their rape, they could not deal with this understanding, that they would have to marry their husband and explain to them why they had lost their virginity and in what conditions this happened. Pani Marta, I'm sorry, how much time yes, I'm wrapping up, sorry. Sorry. Yes, in discussing consequences, I would like to say that women, even having made a clear decision of this sexual barter, they had a very difficult time dealing with it. Here's a very characteristic story of Rina from Lviv. She pretended to be Catholic. She wore a cross, and she was found out by a Pole who propositioned to her for sexual contact or forced her for sexual contact. However, during this sexual contact, she killed him. Other stories tell us about how this choice further influenced relations between these women and their relatives and the group of people who knew about what happened, who knew about this sexual barter, these cases of sexual barter. Their characteristic story is the story of Vera, who describing the sexual contact of her mother with her uncle, she often uses the word I hate Manek, she, thus pointing out that Manek forced her mother to get involved in sexual barter for survival. In conclusion, I would like to say that this topic requires extremely careful treatment and very careful terminology, choice of terminology. It's very important to us to understand the context, the situation, and always take into account the feelings of the victims, men and women, who in these very extreme conditions had to had to step over their own boundaries and the social mores that in which they were raised. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Pani Marta, for this very difficult text. It's very difficult to listen to this, to make sense of it, and it's clear why only many decades after the people only starting to talk about these events many decades after they occurred. It is not for nothing that in France, after the Allies' victory, the brunt of the anger of the population was aimed at women involved in sexual barter that you discuss, the kind of sexual barter that you discuss. What continues? What do we do now? Do we have a discussion, or do we have the next presentation? Right, next presentation. Okay, so Pan Petro Petrogolhanov, you're on. Thank you. Thank you. Can you see the presentation? So my presentation has to do with the economic aspects of interaction in Volhynia with prisoners of the Volyn ghetto. These economic aspects that for a long time were considered a byproduct of the Holocaust. And if they were even taken seriously, they were, an afterthought. They weren't seriously thought about. However, a number of research that showed up in the 2000s show us a very different story. They tell us that this social economic context played a very important role on the micro level. It often affected the behaviors of the local population, legitimized crimes, and allowed the local population to receive property, things, money, valuables of the victims of the Holocaust. And thus they were involved in the consensus of at least collective silence, and sometimes involved in complicit in crimes through these economic motives. Now, these economic motives that are defined by many scholars as an um, important aspect in the discrimination of the other in the broadest sense of the term are mentioned in the work of the famous Canadian sociologist Adam Jones, published with the support of Duchilitera, where greed is seen as one of the aspects, one of the motivators for discrimination. So in our case, when we discuss this social history of the Holocaust in the Volhynia region, it is not just greed and not just social context, but also the interethnic context of these relations, because we're talking about victims who were ethnically different, ethnically other, and often in Volhynia, like in other regions of Volhynia, they were involved in other. They had a different kind of economic activity. They were involved in other economic activity than the local peasant majority. This allowed the local press to appeal to national sentiment. For instance, in this newspaper, we have an example of this manipulation, this appeal. This is a paper from one of the towns in Rivnenshchina in Volhynia. Kostopil was one of the centers of the commissariat, and here's this article that says that the Jews were killed. They were eliminated from a particular economic niche in the economic body of the region, and so they can be replaced by Ukrainians. We see how Ukrainian artisans show up, and the Ukrainian youth add themselves to this stream of economic activity, to join the ranks of artisans. We also see this in free professions, in pharmacy, in medical institutes, various professional schools. We see many youths joining it who already have a secondary education. We see that they're taking the places that have been emptied by foreigners, especially Jews. Now, these appeals to national sentiment were often used in propaganda during occupation, and likely the social factor, social stereotypes also played a role in this kind of ethnic cultural division of labor in the region, because the vast majority of the Jewish population of Volhynia were artisans or members of free professions, or they were merchants. So as far as trade is concerned, there were often the stereotypes that this involves usury, fooling simple peasants, giving them dishonest credits, etc. Here's an excerpt from the memoirs of somebody who lived in the Hoshchan district. Jews, they were these very sly people. When we had small farms, they would buy grain in the fall for the cheapest price, and in the spring, when you had to sow your field, then you go back to these Jews and buy this grain of yours, but now more expensively. And in Korka, so let's say he sells textile, or sometimes they're selling fish or meat. They're these very commercial people. So when God was dividing lands, the Jews were left with forests and mountains, and the Jews didn't hear it. The Jews said "Visayihiri," so weights and measures. So sure, let's have weights and measures. So they have this. So they were involved in trade, but there wasn't much work involved. And another excerpt says, Jews are only good for fooling you. They will lend you money, but it's very difficult to pay it back. However much you pay back, you're still not out of debt. And these stereotypes are there very often in recollections of the contemporaries about the interwar and war period of our history in Bolivia. These social stereotypes probably affected the attitudes to the victims of the Holocaust in the Second World War, the attitudes of the local population to the victims of the Holocaust. So in discussing these forms of economic interaction of the Jews with their neighbors in the Nazi occupation in Volhynia, we can divide them up, classify them into several forms. First, there were the quasi-legal and illegal forms of economic relations. The quasi-legal ones were the ones that were legalized by the occupation authority. You were allowed to buy the property of the victims of the Holocaust, of the dead, for very cheaply. You were allowed to perform trade operations in certain hours, and then the majority of these forms, but the majority of these forms were illegal. In terms of consequences for the victims of the Holocaust, they may have been ambivalent, so that they may have been, depending on the situation, they may have made things worse for the victim or made things better. Situationally, partially made things better, for instance, provided them food that they needed. The disbalanced trade in the ghetto, on the one hand, drained the resources of the victims of the ghetto, but on the other hand, provided them food that they needed. There was shelter, paid shelter. On the one hand, if the agreement was not honored, this might have led to the death of the victims. On the other hand, if these agreements were honored, it would postpone the death of the victims of the Holocaust. It would help them survive for a time in these very difficult times. Now, bribes were demanded by the police, could also be ambivalent in terms of their consequences. Keeping Jewish property, very often going to the ghetto or escaping or understanding what awaits them, they would often give their property to their neighbors, and sometimes part of these neighbors, when in situations of dire need, they would go back to these neighbors and they would ask them to return what they left, and some would return it and some wouldn't, depending on the context. So this form also had these ambivalent consequences. The exploitation of Jewish labor, also with ambivalent consequences. Finally, a number of forms that should be pointed out in the interaction of neighbors with the Jews that were definitely negative, which is participation in pogroms, to rob. It is the surrender of Jews to gain from this, for financial gain. It's murder to rob and appropriate their property. So these robberies, these appropriations of Jewish property started immediately after the entry of the Nazi Germany in the Soviet Union, and with the start of the pogroms in Volhynia, which were raging from between 35 to 42 different localities. Jared McBride mentions that the Germans were absent in 29 of these pogroms, and one of the key motives of these pogrom events was appropriation, was robbery. And so the start of the exploitation of Jewish labor and the appropriation of their property also happened the summer of 1941. One of the examples was the district Uprava in Mlyniv. A letter from the administration of this district administration says, in response to your letter of 2/8, these several Jewish citizens were freed from other works so that they work to repair the Ujin school from the 5th to the 15th of August of 1941. So we see that this exploitation of authority, exploitation of labor was used not only for the Nazis' sake, but also the local authorities also use them to repair schools or to do other things. Or as an example from Kostopil, and there were many such cases, the police would use the Jewish population, would use Jewish labor for their own personal gain and their own personal needs. Now, the earliest mass murders point us to another motive of the reason for this. Now, this very famous photograph in Sosonki, right? The murder after people would look for valuables. Now, these examples were multiple. For instance, police violence. There's the town of Kores, and there are reports of how the police used and even told the relatives of the victims that their relatives were still alive and that they needed valuables. They would meet the wives, and the wives would get clothes. They would walk 40 miles, and the Ukrainian police would meet them. They would beat them and take away their properties. This was from a memoir of Nathan Skaletsky. At the stage of forming ghettos, there was another context of the victims being robbed, and there was particular interest of the local authorities in this, of those who formed city and district administrations. Representatives of the local Ukrainian authorities wanted to quicken the creation of the ghetto in the hope of distributing the real estate property of the Jews. An example provided by Miriam Schwarzman, the example of Miriam Schwarzman, daughter of the head of the Judenrat who started the uprising in the Tuchin ghetto. They confirmed this. Kreisland Grebner informed my father that representatives of the Ukrainian institutions, Kharachuk, Ostalenko, Polishchuk, have sent a report to Rivne with a demand to create a ghetto for the Hebrew. There were 10 signatures. So the local enthusiasts might have had their economic motives for wanting the ghetto to be formed as soon as possible. Among these were the extortion of bribes. Often in the recollections mentioned the extortion of bribes. The Judenrat had to organize a list of people to work and took care that all the Jews come back from work. The Judenrat paid huge bribes to those who contacted with the Jews, the Grebner, the police, Ukrainians, and those who controlled the work. This is by Miriam Schwarzman. And then by Michael Dement, the peasants began to surreptitiously bring flour, potatoes, and other produce. Even if the police caught someone, there were always people with correct connections who could help. After getting the bribe, the influential people could resolve all issues. And these corruption forms would situationally, short-term, sometimes ease the fate of the victims. Another form of exploitation of Jewish labor is very ambivalent in terms of the consequences for the victims, because on the one hand, this allowed the Jews who had nothing to exchange food for, exchange food and get food in exchange for labor. Because yes, they would not only work for occupational authorities, they would also work for the locals, for the local peasants. But there have been different cases and different consequences. For instance, Vera Shchetkova from Stepin mentions how her sister and she worked for the peasants, and they would sometimes bring bread and other foods to the ghetto. And for a time, they managed to feed her family in the Stepin ghetto. Child labor for food was quite widespread. Very often, it would be the local Jews local Jewish children who knew village labor, who knew agricultural labor. However, the exploitation of Jewish labor took many forms, and often the police would resort to it. Who would abuse the Jews. For instance, there is a material from a criminal investigation. There's an example in the Ostrov ghetto. there are instances of abuse in another ghetto, of exploitation of the victims of the Holocaust. And then one of the most widespread forms of economic relations was simply unjust exchanges or unjust barter. For instance, artisanal work. So when the Judenrat was looking for workplaces for the Jews of Tuchin, there would be workshops. Germans and Ukrainians would also place private orders for clothes, for shoes, for their wives and children, etc. Valuables would also be exchanged for food. This is one of the also a very widespread form of economic interaction. Mary Stoller mentions we are very limited in food. We exchanged with the peasants. A number of material was very, very important. Clothes, fabric that you had, you would exchange. You would give up to the peasants in exchange for flour or potatoes. These exchanges allowed people to have food. However, not always. It wasn't always that the local population. These exchanges were not always equal. Sometimes even gold would be exchanged for potatoes, which would, of course, quickly exhaust and deplete the resources of the prisoners of the ghetto. Of course, as soon as they ran out of their valuables, hunger would start, which is a tendency very clearly described in the memoirs. So okay, 41 was still okay. Everybody still had things. People from the nearest villages, they could give you flour for your shoes or for a good dress. They might give you a box of potatoes or half a liter of milk. In 42, people were dying of hunger. They ate whatever they could get. This is from a memoir by Avram Anapolsky of the Korzec ghetto, also in the Visual History Archive. So, what can we conclude from these forms of economic relations? The key forms of non-Jewish population interaction with prisoners of the ghetto were exchanges, exploitation of labor, including child labor, and extortion of bribes. This would often benefit the police and the local administration, but also the broader non-Jewish population of the surrounding villages and towns, mainly Ukrainians and Poles, because they formed the majority of this population. The consequences of this unequal economic, unjust economic interaction were ambivalent. In the short term, they granted the prisoners food, but in the long term, it depleted their resources, including their physical resources, and eventually that led to their death. As soon as the prisoners ran out of valuables, the neighbors usually stopped exchanges and hunger would start. Many people were not afraid of illegal trade, in spite of the interdiction to do this, and the risk of punishment by the occupational authority. However, the majority did not want to help for free, pro bono, when the resources ran out and there was no longer financial gain to be had. It's probably not just greed, but also the factor of stereotype, these sly people, as the Jews were often termed, as the peasants often termed the Jews. Stereotypes generated the greed, but caused very limited empathy to provoke pro bono help. Thank you. Thank you, Petre. I think both your presentation and tell us that almost all of the appraisals we try to give to the time show us that we're dealing with a completely different, very particular conditions and a very different measure of. It's very difficult to provide categorical moral appraisal of particular behaviors, but I think we'll talk about this more in the discussion. Next, and I understand the final presenter at this session is Mr. Yuri Kaparulin. The floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues, for inviting me and offering me the opportunity to speak at this colloquium. I would primarily like to apologize for my voice. I was recently had a cold, but I hope you can all hear me, and I will try to be clear. Okay, can you see my presentation? Yes. All right. So the Holocaust in the territory of Ukraine led to the murder of about 1.4 million Jews and the destruction of various Jewish communities. And in Ukraine, in Soviet Ukraine in the 1920s, there was this unique community in the southern regions of Ukraine. In the 1920s, there was an attempt to create a social and economic experiment with the Soviet authorities, the agriculturalization of the Soviet population. So on this map, you can see the territories from Dnipro and Zaporizhia to Crimea, where there would be new Jewish settlements. These would usually arise in place of old colonies known as far back as the 19th century. But the scale of this project was truly impressive in terms of its ambition. In the years of the Second World War, the Jewish population of these national regions, there were entire national regions, so-called national regions, came under Nazi fire. Of Nazi ideology, which of course led to the death of most of those who were in this territory. And in my presentation, I would like to focus on the situation that arose in one small settlement. The settlement didn't even have a name. It was simply called Settlement Number 6. Some called it Neindorf, but it was number 6 as it was formed in 1924. It features. That name features both among the residents of the settlement and the neighboring settlements. And before we switch to the period of the Second World War, I would like to describe the situation of life in this area before the war. So the idea was that the Jews would resettle here in droves, in entire labor collectives. And what happened is that whole families would gather from the towns and they would resettle to the territory, to these southern territories. And as of 1926, this settlement number 6 had 433 people. Most of them came out of Kyiv, Chernihiv, Proskuriv, which is Khmelnytsky today, and they were the ones brought in to work agriculturally and to create these new collective farms. In 1928, a book came out, actually notes by Semen Epstein, who visited these labor collectives in southern Ukraine, and he visited this settlement number 6, which is in today's Kherson region. And he pointed at the next. We're going through the 6th settlement, and we see a flock of well-fed cows. We see the red German breed mostly. They chew and swat away flies. We see a well, and it takes 3 to 5 minutes to draw a bucket of water from the well, so deep it is. The lack of water is a problem for the resettlers. One such source serves the whole settlement, and sometimes more than one. Epstein wrote this. This was essentially a propaganda brochure, but which calling the Jews to resettle. But he also pointed out the real problems that people faced in these new locations. And this well that he mentions is a symbolic object because out of the symbols of life in the mid-1920s, and these wells would later turn to symbols of death in the 1940s in the war, because they would be the locations for shootings and mass burials of the Jewish population. However, the positive mood that was being formed by the politicians and administrators to cause the Jews to resettle was done by the 1930s. Now these collective farms, this was all collectivized, and this collective farm was called the Pioneer Collective Farm. Now, again, people would be taken, the property would be taken from people to be collectivized, and so in the 1930s, Jews would massively return to their old homes, but part of the Jews remained, and non-Jews would come to replace the ones who left. So the pre-war period, what happened is that by the late 1930s, both Jews and non-Jews would live in the territories of these areas. As far as the Kaliningrad Jewish National District is concerned, as this was known, as of 1939, 40% of the population was Jewish. Over 40% were Ukrainian, and about 10 to 15 were Russians and Germans. In the summer of 1941, after the heavy losses by the Red Army in their retreat to the east, and in August of 1941, German military entered the Kaliningrad region in late August. But by the August 28th, the entire region was taken. Now, in evacuations, part of the population managed to escape. However, several dozen thousand people couldn't or wouldn't evacuate and ended up in the evacuation area. Among those who stayed in the occupation was the brigadier of the tractor brigade, Semen Bili, who lived in the collective farm number 6. He was Ukrainian, and in an investigation, in an interrogation, he said that he attempted to evacuate his tractor park. However, he didn't manage to do it because the ferry was overloaded. However, the materials say that he stayed deliberately, and then he gave his tractor park to the occupation administration and immediately started collaborating with the new local authorities as head of the Ukrainian police. According to Bili's testimony, the German military came to the village in several weeks and asked how many Jews were still in the village. Bili was charged with collecting the Jews, gathering the Jews in the local school. About 120 people showed up, Jews. Among these were also residents of the neighbor settlements number 23 and number 19 of the Kahanovich and Abramich collective farms. So in the morning, sometime in late September, we don't know the exact date, but this is about the second half or late September, SS groups would come to, SS detachments would come to the settlement, and they would take the Jews, take 20 in groups of 25 to 30 people, and they would take them to the old well next to the village settlement where the shootings occurred. After this, Semen Bili had to collect Jewish property that would be taken to the schools and sold off an auction. Another testimony by Viktor Andrushenko says that Semen Bili himself put together lists of Jews and submitted them to the local gendarmerie, that he participated in the murders with the local starosta Ivan Samoilovich and 5 German officers who arrived. So the materials of the case shows that Semen Bili was the head of the auxiliary police in August, December 1942, and participated in the murder of the local Jewish population of the collective farm and the neighboring settlements. the military tribunal of NKVD in Kherson, at a closed trial, Seman was sentenced. He was sentenced for 20 years hard labor with confiscation of property without right of appeal. The crime seems obvious. However, the materials of the case are actually quite limited in terms of his personality and his motives to stay under occupation. And his version that he said that he only collaborated during his stupidity is clearly not believable. The criminal case says that Semen Bili was born in 1905 in a poor peasant Ukrainian family. Until 1933, he was working in the village with his father. In 1928, he married. He had 3 daughters. In 1933, his father died. And then, as he mentions, he started living on his own, or he started his own life. In this same year, we know that he was sentenced for 3 years of imprisonment according to the criminal code of the Ukrainian Soviet criminal code. And later he graduated from a brigadier school and later worked as brigadier in the settlement number 6 of the Pioneer settlement, where he worked until the war. We can suppose that the death of his father had to do with the Holodomor of 1932, the famine of 1932-1933, and the trial of Bili himself was because of the illegal use of natural resources, which was due to an attempt to feed his family. So it probably affected his attitudes to the Soviet authorities and his decision to stay in the occupied territories. Now, it's not enough. These sources are not enough to understand the motives, and so it was very important for me to find other documents that would tell of Bili's participation in the shooting of the Jews. Now, of course, the crime itself was organized and perpetrated by an SS detachment of the Einsatzgruppe D, specifically the Sonderkommando 11A, headed by Leo von der Ecke and Baal Zap, who were also sentenced in 1970 in Germany after having hidden from investigation for several decades. Memories of the survivors are extremely important here, and we have a unique source here, the pretty detailed memoirs of Rita Rosenberg, who managed to survive in that situation. As has been mentioned, the world of Jewish collective farms was not closed, and many of the resettlers came from big towns. So Rita herself came to her aunt from Kiev, and the thing is that her own mother stayed in Kiev. Rita's mother stayed in Kiev, but every year from the mid-1930s, Rita came to her aunt for summer vacations, summer holidays. This happened in 1941 when Rita came alone without her parents to visit her aunt in the Kherson region. Soon after finding out about the approach of the German troops, they decided to evacuate. So Rita's aunt collected their property. They took all of the nearest relatives and set out. However, they didn't manage to get to the evacuation because the ferry they were moving to was damaged, and the territory was already occupied by the Germans by the time they got there. So they had to return. Almost immediately after the arrival of the German troops, Rita mentioned that this was most of all primarily the Wehrmacht, and she did not mention any kind of cruel treatment of the locals. She was in friends with one of the soldiers, dislocated in their house. But later, she started hearing, by the way, she spoke German, which helped her survive later. She started hearing from the conversations of the locals about SS detachments arriving. And after the SS detachments arrived, the military almost immediately left. And so after the Sonderkommando arrived, that's when the Aktion began, the killing action began. Rita mentions that all the Jews were told to show up at the local school with their valuables. They were divided into three groups: women and children. So women with children, men, and women without children. Rita ended up in the first group that were locked in a separate classroom. This was all administered by the local police of the local Ukrainian police. Um, Covered trucks would show up at school with conveyed by armed Germans, and the Ukrainians would show where to get in. Now, after the Jews were loaded into trucks, they were taken by the road, and then they were taken to the field. She said, "This is when I understood that this was the end. After I saw that they started getting us off the truck, I saw I saw a load of clothes, and then I saw a dress, my aunt's dress, and then I saw a well surrounded by Germans with guns. Next to them were two Ukrainians, a neighbor of my aunt named Billy, and another one who was the starosta. All around were dogs and Germans standing on a hill. This was the old well, which was no longer in use. It was called the Bila Krynica, the White Well. So Rita was in the last line of people who were about to be shot. She noticed one German who was ordering people around, and she decided to work. And because she spoke German, she came up to him and she said it was an accident that she was here, that her father was Russian and her mother was a Jew. She said that their neighbor Simon Bili can confirm this, and she pointed him out with her finger. And I will quote that she said, "I came up to the German and said that I'm here by accident, that my father is German, mother is Jewish. I pointed at Billy that he can confirm this." And the German asked him, and he nodded affirmatively. So she was left alive, and two other children were also let go. Rita Rosenberg's story is a unique example because not many people managed to escape from the place of shooting in this village locality, in this rural locality. Later, together with these two children, she wandered to the local villages, but she understood that this could not continue. If she wanted to survive, she had no warm clothes. This was now late September, and so Rita decided to go back to her village. She returned to Simon Bili, asked him to help get things that she hid before evacuation. He accepted her and agreed to help. From everything that he found, he gave her several bed sheets and a warm head covering. He took everything else. The girl understood that there was no point to stay under Billy, and she went to a different village. Eventually, Rita ended up in the settlement of Czerwone, where she was sheltered by a young Ukrainian woman named Nadia. And she was with her until the end of the occupation. Rita's parents managed to evacuate from Kiev and later came back to live at their old apartment in 1944, and she wrote them a letter to Kiev, and the mother personally came to pick her up. In 1998, living in New York by now, she told her story to employees of the Shoah Foundation. This story allows us to see the circumstances of the Holocaust on a micro level in a rural community with this very limited circle of witnesses and actors, if you could say that. Now, the story of Rita Rosenberg demonstrates a different perspective of events of 1941, particularly as far as Simon Bili is concerned. The analysis of this person, to me, is obviously more research is needed, but we can understand that in this case, in the same moment by the well, Billy was performing the role both of perpetrator and savior, paradoxical as it may be, and as at odds as it may be with our understanding. So the gray areas of the Holocaust and can in time can change the roles of people in the same circumstances. I will try to tell you more about this story and the story of Rita and the story of Simone in my article that I hope to see published in Ukraina Moderna. I will be delighted to continue discussing this subject in discussion. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Thank you, Pane Yuri. So we can now switch to comments and discussions. We'll give the floor, first of all, to Professor Kai Struve.
Yes, thank you very much for this, for the invitation to comment on this very interesting papers that I believe clearly show the strong rise in new approaches among researchers, among young researchers of the Holocaust in Ukraine during in the recent years. They show, all these papers show, I think, a strong or certain reception of questions, methods, and approaches in international Holocaust research, and at the same time they are strongly source-based and focus on local cases. They rely strongly on testimonies of both Jews and non-Jews, and that relates also in the way to the discussions we had yesterday about different methods and also how to integrate and include different kind of sources in the research on local events. I will now shortly comment on each individual paper and then conclude with one or two questions for each of the presenters, and I think that we can then start a more general discussion. Marta Havryshko presented an especially rich paper, I believe. She skillfully analyzed, based on the very convincing concept of sexual barter, how women were forced to use their bodies in order to create for themselves and people close to them conditions for survival. In a very precise and clear way, she analyzed the three dimensions of sexual barter: the problem of agency of women under the extreme conditions of the Holocaust, emotional effects on the women, and the impact of on relations with people close to them. And she did that both in a very sensitive and differentiated way. And she showed, I think, very clearly the wide range of different contexts and different appearances of this phenomenon of sexual barter. And the paper showed also very clearly how an approach as gender history can contribute strongly to the Holocaust studies and to further insights in the processes that happened during the German occupation. I have somewhat I have two somewhat related questions, or two questions that maybe are somewhat related among each other's questions or remarks, comments. They both refer to this problem of stigmatization that you referred to at the beginning of your paper. Yes, and I'm wondering if I mean you discussed about that women were somewhat reluctant to speak about this sexual relations or forced sexual relations on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think there are you have such reports in a rather large number of testimonies of Jewish women, and yes, was there really such a strong stigmatization as also Leonid Finberg referred to when he compared it with this situation in France after all these things we know from France after the end of the war. And what came to my mind, what maybe I don't know if it makes sense to compare that, but you have also reports from and that is also a different context, reports about women from the Soviet anti-German underground and also from the Ukrainian nationalist underground after the end of World War II that went into sexual relationships with German or Soviet officers in order to gain information and help the resistance. And these women, as I understand, were rather presented as heroes. Yes, my question is, or the background for this remark is the question if that makes sense to compare that, or if there is we can better understand this phenomenon by such a comparison. Yes, I come to the second paper. Petro Darkanov, I think, addressed the very important and very interesting subject of economic relations between Jews and non-Jews in the period of the Holocaust. And I think it's also very important to, should be stressed that it's very important to have additional research on Volhynia. I think it's not maybe it's not only a coincidence that the only literature that you quoted in your presentation is the book by Shmuel Spector that I think appeared in the English edition in 1990, and the Hebrew original appeared even somewhat earlier, but it means he had no access to a large number of sources we have access to now. And therefore, I believe that it's especially urgent to have more research also on this region. We know, I think, rather than we don't know very much about. I think that you very well and very interestingly showed the different or described the different dimensions of economic relations and different contexts of the economic exploitation of Jews and different contexts of robbery. Yes, I have two questions, one rather specific and one more general. You referred also to the economic impact of the motif of robbery or greed on this problem of pogroms in summer 1941, and based your conclusions on also there on Shmuel Spector. My conclusion in this case for the region of Galicia, that may be somewhat different from Volhynia, is that economic motives were not important there. Somewhat in contrast to what Spector wrote about Volhynia. The basic motive was was the identification of Jews with as beneficiaries and supporters of Soviet rule, and the if property was robbed, or often property was also destroyed. This was rather part of attacks on Jews, because they were identified with Soviet rule. Yes, so that is one comment to this question of robbery in the pogroms, and the other more general question, and that can be maybe addressed also to this paper of Pavlo Hudish that we have not heard now is that, but I think is also a more general question, is that if concepts of bystander, especially the concept, categories of victims, bystander, and perpetrators, and especially the category of bystanders, as it has been developed rather on Western European societies, Germany or France, where Jews were very well integrated, where Jews were part of the civic society of there were occurred a process of exclusion of Jews from society at least in Germany during the 1930s. To which extent really such categories can apply to societies as in Volhynia, especially in Volhynia, but also in Transcarpathia, where you have a rather more traditional structure, where you have Jews and non-Jews, Jews and peasants, and however you would describe this, and where you have already in the pre-war period, and that refers especially to this economic dimension, where you have already in the pre-war period a lot of competition between groups based on religious, ethnic, national identities, and to what extent this may force to differentiate or to have these categories, or to which extent we also need new categories. Yes, I would like to finish now with some short comments on the third paper by Yuri Kaparulin that addresses the very interesting case of the Jewish rural settlements in southern Ukraine, and has put basically two testimonies in the center of the analysis. One of a Ukrainian policeman and one of a Jewish woman who refer both to the same places and refer both to the same mass execution, and probably, if I understood that correctly, in September 1941. And this policeman helped her to escape. And on the one hand, I think this paper in an exemplary way shows how one of the difficulties of Holocaust research for these regions, also for small localities, that you have the sources and you need to combine different sources to come to clear conclusion that you have sources from very different contexts. I think one of the sources were these interrogations of the Soviet Extraordinary Commission in 1944, and another source was in was an interview with a Jewish survivor in the end of the 1990s in the US. Yes, I think that's my question here is that the way it became not, or maybe you can the research question of this paper did not become really clear for me, or need, I think, a somewhat stronger focus. It was not, on the one hand, it could be a study on this case of this the settlement that you referred to. On the other hand, it can be or the question is, the other possibility is that it is a study on this phenomena of Ukrainian policemen, or you also have find it sometimes between the German police personnel or other German officials. This phenomenon that people participated in and personally participated in mass murder on the one hand, and on the other hand, they in some cases they also helped Jews. So that I think are the two possibilities to develop the paper. And my question is, what is your plan or intention? Thank you.
Дякую, пане професоре, за ваш коментар, за ваше питання. Знаю, що у нас дуже мало часу.
Thank you, Professor, for your commentary and your questions. I know we don't have much time until the conclusion of this panel, because everybody who spoke has 2, maybe 3 minutes tops to provide answers or comments. Please, Pani Marta, we'll start with you. Thank you, Professor Struve, for your comments and your thoughtful perception of my presentation. So in answer to your question about the stigmatization, so feminist researchers who have been studying the subject for a long time, Myrna Goldenberg, Zoe Waxman, and others, point out that the earliest memories of the women right after the war were less marked by stigma. And by the way, I see this also in descriptions of violence scenes from the archive of criminal cases in 1944, 1945. These women very openly speak about what they experienced as far as the sexual violence is concerned. But further on, later, and now we're talking about the 60s to the 80s, this is where silences begin, because there's an image of, there's this myth of chastity or purity, or this was caused partly by an article that described the wards of the Krakow religious school, the Jewish girls, who were supposedly committed mass suicide in order to avoid being raped by the Germans. I know that one Polish scholar is now looking at this to prove that this actually happened. However, there was this myth around this event that the true, proper, from Jewish woman must not use the resource of her body, and she must save her dignity, because it is the dignity of the entire group. So this myth of propriety stigmatized women, causing them to silence their experience. However, especially after the tribunals in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, after genocides, after internationally, it was recognized that sexual violence is a crime against humanity, not only a crime against a particular scene. It is a crime of genocide, because it is aimed against the entire group, and it must be taken seriously, considering the consequences not just for the person but for the entire group. We see that this silence started to break, particularly in the milieu of women who had left the Soviet Union. So we're talking about Australia, America, Canada. But stigmatization now, especially after the publication of this book, her sister had problems. So this Helena, who lived in a conservative Jewish community, she faced problems that had to do with the social perception of the phenomenon. So we see the continuation of this stigmatization on various levels. So this really is a very complicated concept. Thank you. this is the second part about women in the national underground. Maybe we can talk about this in more detail later, because in the my last article, you can find out that the nationalists actually punished women who had sexual liaisons with officers of the Red Army. They would cut their hair, they might mutilate them, they would rape them. So we have similar practices as in France for the so-called horizontal collaboration. Thank you. Thank you, Pani Marto. There was a book published not that long ago in Israel about the various appraisals of the capo, of the Jewish police. This is also a very difficult subject, very delicate subject, and very difficult to appraise it morally, to offer it moral judgment. But it's one of the first works of this kind. We're hoping to get rights to it, to publish it. And I think looking at these phenomena has to happen in parallel, because scholars gradually attempt to approach these subjects that were difficult to approach earlier. There was only the empirical fixation. It was very difficult to think about and make sense. Petra, I think it's your time. It's your turn. Thank you, Dr. Struve, for your comments and your very interesting questions. I'm actually looking forward to the publication of the Ukrainian translation of your book. I've seen some of your publications previously in English on this subject, and I actually used them in some of my publications that have to do with the economic motives of the work of the behavior of the local population. Thank you for your attention to the organization of the pogroms and the key motives, key organizational motives. And your point that it wasn't economic factors weren't the main factors in the violence. So I would like to specify here, in terms of talking about the economic motivation of the pogroms, I meant not the organizational level, not the organization of the pogroms themselves, but the involvement of the population, the local population. And these cases often happen during the pogroms, when the population would join with the motive of gain or robbery. The ordinary peasants, not the organizers. Now, here I also rely not just on the works by Shmuel Spector, but a more recent study by Jared McBride, his dissertation, where he also manages to establish several cases where, again, at the level of involvement, not organizational level, often many of the representatives of the population later said that they robbed, that they joined with the motive of robbing. But I think it's a very important comment that you made, and I will be more attentive to this aspect. I'll pay more attention to this aspect and the economic context of the pogroms in the future in studying this subject. Now, as for the concept of bystander and to what extent it is applicable to Volhynia, I rather lean to the methodological stance that hold that we prefer not to use this concept, and I try to talk about forms of economic behavior, forms of economic interaction, so as to refrain from appraising different people as perpetrator or bystander or victim, but rather, because there really are examples when people resorted to different kinds of economic behavior. Sometimes they might participate in robbery and lower the victim's chances of survival. In other cases, they might have helped their Jewish neighbors, provide them food. And there are numerous such cases too, when Jews would run out of valuables and they would turn for help. They would, and some would provide help and some wouldn't. or help in some situations and not in others, because either they couldn't or they were afraid to do so. But all these things are much more involved and complicated than this concept of bystander offers us. But the question that you have about the interwar period and the interethnic relations in interwar Volhynia, yes, this was quite difficult and strong competition, and I have a hypothesis that I have yet to research and then confirm or deny whether economic and political competition between different ethnic groups might have affected the interethnic relations in Volhynia in the wartime, particularly the Ukrainian Jewish and Ukrainian Polish relations. This hypothesis rests on the slogan "Go to your own to support your own, turn to your own to support your own." Now, this was used by the Poles and Ukrainians in Galicia, but far less by Ukrainians in Volhynia, and much more by Poles in Volhynia. So, testimonials by those who survived the Holocaust, testimony by those who survived the Holocaust, mentions that the Jews often mention that their business was boycotted. And they most often mention the organized boycott of the 1930s, late second half of the 1930s, on behalf of the Polish youth or the Polish political movements. I suppose that this might have affected the relations of the local population with the Jews during the Holocaust, but I'm not prepared to conclude that definitively, because it's very difficult to determine in the sources that we have whether this ideology actually affected interethnic relations, or whether perhaps it was other factors. So robbery is a universal event, and those forms of economic relations that existed might have been practiced even without ideology. So it's very difficult for me to draw clear conclusions. Thank you again for your comments. Very interesting questions. Thank you. Thank you, Petra. Do we have a few more minutes, or do we have to wrap up? Do we have 5 more minutes? Yes. It's a question for you. Okay. We'll steal 5 minutes from the next. We have to listen to Yuri's answer. Right. That's why I'm asking whether we have the right to do that. Right. So, okay, thank you. I'll just say a quick remark about the economic exploitation. We must keep in mind that during the war and after the war, we were dealing with this very impoverished population. In my mom's memoirs, she came back from evacuation. She survived. She said that some of the neighbors would return the property and say, but Rita, we preserved this for you, and others wouldn't. And so in that poverty, all these things, all these most basic things, starting from, like pots and pans, they meant something, whereas we're appraising it, but we're judging it from later. Anyway, Yuri, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you, Kai Struve, for your questions and comments. I have to say that this case that I was looking at is also new to me. I think I myself am thinking which way to turn it, what focus to employ, and I'm starting to reach the conclusion that maybe it would make sense to discuss the phenomenon of the Ukrainian police locally. Although this study is first of all empirical, so I would like to point out some problems in it. Firstly, yes, the study of the history of the Holocaust on the local level in these locations where small groups of population lived, it faces some problems, one of which is the problem of sources. So very often, apart from information from the Extraordinary Commission, we have nothing. And so this testimony of the survivors of the criminal case give us a much clearer idea, a much broader idea of the course of events in those months of 1941. But I should point out that this case also raises other questions that have to do with what Petr Dolhanov said, the economic factors of the Holocaust, because the instance of Semen Bili tells us from different sources that he wanted to, of greed, of property. Now, because it's not clear why in a village somebody would want quite that many things taken from Jews or from murdered Jews. This is somewhat beyond. So it's hard. On the one hand, sure, there's the lust for enrichment, but then where did it come from? But whether perhaps it has something to do with his pre-war experience. So this is an interesting case for me and an interesting subject that I want to develop. So yeah, thank you for your comment. I think in the context, I think I will continue this in the context of Ukrainian police. Thank you, Yuri. At our center, at the Mohila Academy, we have a large archive, Shaikin's archive. He had a lot of materials on Jewish collective farms, and for a long time, he corresponded with the with the survivors and their ancestors. So this is any use to you, please talk to us. We'll be happy to share. Thank you. I've had the chance to look at this in the memorial of the Holocaust Memorial in the USA. You know, I have the copy, but I know you have a lot of interesting information. So I'll be happy to look. Yes, and I also like to point out another aspect that I think is understudied. And this is the information that I have. We were preparing a book and exhibition on agrojoint in Ukraine. So the situation there was, so okay, the agrojoint was there, was helping everybody, and then at some point Soviet repression came and everybody was repressed. But the interesting thing is that after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed, the German Jews who were working in these Ukrainian villages or in Jewish collective farms or other settlements, the Soviet authorities gave these Jews up to the Nazis in 1939. I don't know if there are studies like this, if these processes are studied like after that pact. Perhaps that weren't that many Jews who hid in territories where there was no war. I would like to thank you all the colleagues. I think these are very interesting presentations, have been very interesting presentations, and I would like to also thank Mr. Kai Struve, Professor Struve, and I think we can move to our next session, our next roundtable. Thank you very much.